I'm going to be discussing this further with Stephen in our subscribers section. I believe, and I just want to say at the outset of the show before William takes over, this is one of the most important books I've read in maybe a very, very long time. There are issues here that are absolutely essential to understand in order to be part of the change of the age in the way that all of us who are gathered around in this dreamland community and unknown country community and this larger community of seekers are here to be. There are signals in here that you need to know. Very important book, From Light into Darkness. So with that said, let me welcome William Henry to this radio program as guest host of Dreamland.
Thank you, Whitley, very much. As Whitley said, our guest today is Stephen Mehler. Stephen, as Whitley has mentioned here, and I think is as excited as I am about talking with him, is Stephen's just a true spark of the light of truth. After his book, Land of Osiris, was published in 1998, he jumped to the top of the class of independent Egyptologists. There's few better than Stephen Mehler. He's the director of the Great Pyramid of Giza Research Association, along with Christopher Dunn. And he's been reviving an indigenous oral tradition that still exists in Egypt. And he's been able to uncover and study it with the help of a living master of this tradition, Hakim. Stephen's here with a wake-up call and to discuss teachings that existed before religion and other subjects from his new book, From Light into Darkness. Stephen, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you, William. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and it's great to be on Dreamland again.
Really a pleasure, and thank you for making time to talk with us today. Stephen, I've got about a million things I'd like to ask you about. Of course, your work with the indigenous teacher Hakim, your work with Christopher Dunn. You've been making some incredible discoveries about the prehistory of Egypt and about cycles of consciousness. And even though you've been at this over 35 years, it appears as if you're just getting started. Talk about how things have changed in terms of your perception of Egypt and where things are at this particular moment.
Well, yes, we say formally I've been studying the subject for over 37 years, as you mentioned, but it really has been a lifelong search for me. It happened around the age of 8, two significant events in my life, and I just happened to see a picture of the Great Pyramid and Sphinx in a National Geographic magazine, and something always stuck in my mind about it. It didn't spark me at that moment to say that Egyptology was going to be my life's goal, but I always had an interest in Egypt, and all the contemporary things that came around in my life about Egypt just didn't seem to make sense. It seemed to be there was more beyond what was presented to me. So always maintained an interest in that, but it was significantly a book in 1968, published posthumously after Sigmund Freud died, called Moses and Monotheism. It really was the spark for me. And since 1968, this has been my life search and life work. And it led me through the academic field of Egyptology, which didn't seem to satisfy. I then went into the metaphysical, mystery school tradition of the Rosicrucian Order, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. And there still seemed to be more to it. And eventually, to make a really long story short, in 1992, I had the opportunity to go to Egypt. I knew at that point that there was an existence of an oral tradition that was still evident in Egypt. I went in search of it, and lo and behold, the first day I was in Egypt, my tour guide was the gentleman you mentioned, Abdel Hakim Aoyan. Everybody knows him as Hakim. He has been an active tour guide. He's basically semi-retired now for over 50 years, and there he was, and he is the keeper of the oral tradition.
So now, what would you say is the primary question you're trying to answer, or maybe have answered as a result of your recent research?
Well, first of all, I consider myself, among many other researchers today, like yourself, a paradigm buster, in that the accepted paradigms of academia don't seem to fit for me. And one of the most stringent paradigms that I'm most against is this idea of linear evolution, that everything is moved in a straight line. Actually physical evolution and human evolution. And the major theme that Hakim presents to us is a similar theme among indigenous people all around the world, Native Americans, Maya people, Hopi people, pre-Incan people, and people in Asia and in Africa, that things move in cycles, not in a straight line. And we have been through a series of cycles before there was a beginning, because the tradition says it even wasn't a beginning. So the idea that we bring forth is that we have been through a series of cycles in human evolution, cultural and physical, and that we're coming to the end of a particular phase of a major cycle now. And this is a key teaching that you, I know, have seen reflected mythologies of all people around the world, the Mayan calendar, the Hopi calendar, the Aztec calendar. So many groups around the world of indigenous wisdom keepers are saying we're coming to the end of a cycle now. And this is one of the major facets of Hakim's teaching, that we're coming out of a cycle of darkness. That's the reason's the title of my book, From Light into Darkness. We're coming out of a cycle in darkness, ready to come to a dawn of a new consciousness, which he calls the awakening.
And I really like the idea of the cycles, the concept, because as you point out in your book, From Darkness into Light, or pardon me, Stephen, From Light into Darkness, the symbol for the cycle is a circle. And another way of describing a circle is a ring. And a ring is one of those curious words. It's a pun, a play on words, because a ring is also a vibration. And of course, as you talk so eloquently, vibration is really what all of this is all about, isn't it?
Very, very good. That's very much a key point. And again, you see so many cooperations and collaborations from different teachings. One of the major things I learned getting involved with the Rosicrucian teachings, the Rosicrucian order, AMARC, which means AMORC, which means Ancient Mystical Order Rosicrucis, is one of the basic teachings that all is vibration, all. And so that everything is vibratory rate that exists in the actual, and it's what we create as reality is what we perceive those vibrations that filter through our brain processes or whatever, and we create reality. And this is one of the basic teachings that we know the ancient Cometians, Egyptians had, and it is relevant, and it's being demonstrated today in quantum physics. One of the major quotes I use in my book from quantum physicist Fred Alan Wolf is, "The vacuum vibrates," which discussing, everything that is. So vibration is very key. And that comes to a concept of the use of sound by ancient people, the use of vibration, the understanding this. And one of the key things that we're bringing forward is that we were those people. In other words, a major facet of Whitley's work in Dreamland is, of course, a possibility of the extraterrestrial connection, a possibility that we are not indigenous to this planet, that we may be starseeds, which I agree, and which is part of a lot of indigenous teachings, part of Hakim's teachings too. But the idea is that we were these ancient people that built the pyramids, carved the Sphinx, but that we have fallen. And this is where the fall comes through. And in your work, which is so much a part of mythology, this fall from a golden age, from a time when we were in total consciousness. And this is a key part of Hakim's teachings, that we are just been semi-conscious this last 5,000 years of this cycle, and we're about to wake out of that. And so vibrations are part of breaking up this darkness and getting us back into the light.
Yeah, this idea of full consciousness is one of the ideas that you propose that really caught my imagination. And you, in conjunction with that, you describe an age of Aten when people had full consciousness. What does this term full consciousness mean, and what happened to these people?
Well, again, and here's a key difference, perhaps, in Hakim's presentation from other people, and that nobody was at fault. A lot of another facet of your work is Atlantis and the myth of Atlantis. And a lot of people put forth the contention that Atlantis fell because of the degeneration of people's thinking and practices. Now that may be true. I don't deny that may not be true. But Hakim is very adamant that this is just a natural progression of cycles. So we go through what he calls the 5 stages of the sun. The number 5, and many numbers, but 5 is one of the key numbers in this teaching. 5 stages of the sun, 5 stages of our consciousness, 5 stages of human evolution. And the stage of Aten that you mentioned, Aten in his translation means the wiser, which means the full state of consciousness, full flowering of the senses, where we could actually say that everybody was in some degree of enlightenment. And it's just a natural state that we then go into Amen, the state we're in now, which means the hidden darkness, and that we fell from consciousness, and we forgot who we were. And it's taken us 5,000 years to get to the point now where we are beginning your work, my work, Whitley's work, everybody's work who comes on this show to be interviewed by you is part of bringing back the dawn, the awakening, coming back into consciousness. So it's a natural cycle. He does not see a blame. He does not see blaming anybody. It's God's fault. It's human's fault. It's behavior's fault. It is just a natural cycle. So we go up to a higher stage, Aten, and then we fall to the lowest stage. And it is a big fall. And that's the stage we're coming out of.
Yeah, and one of the terms that you introduced in a moment ago is this word Cometian wisdom teachings. Let's start with that name. Who are the people of Kemet, and what are the Cometian wisdom teachings?
Well, again, it has to do, and this is how I usually basically start all my presentations on this subject, because we don't teach Egyptology. Egypt is the name of the country northeastern Africa today. That's the people today are Egyptians, but that's not what the ancient people called themselves. Egypt is based on a Greek word, Egyptos, which is a contraction of an ancient term. It only referred to one area, which in Egyptology was known as Memphis, the capital of the Old Kingdom, so to speak, or the beginning of the modern dynastic cycle. But the ancient people called their civilization Kemet, actually written without vowels as KMT, also known as Kem, Al-Kem. People talk about the land of Kem. Al-Kem, the Arabic term for it, is where the word alchemy comes from. It's the art and wisdom of Kemet. So we refer to the ancient civilization as Kemet. So therefore the people were Cometian, their language was Cometian, and that's why we, Hakim and I, and there are many other people, I'm not the only one, are actually starting a new discipline, Kemetology, not Egyptology. And that's why I tell people I don't teach Egyptology, I teach Kemetology. So Kemet was the ancient civilization, so we speak of them as the ancient Cometians.
And it's from this perspective that now we can make a statement, as I believe you did either in your book or one of your DVD presentations, is that all Egyptologist interpretations of hieroglyphs are maybe open to question now, aren't they?
Very much so, and that's one of my biggest challenges, and believe me, that's a big challenge, and a lot of people cannot accept that, because basically the language was lost for many, many, many hundreds and maybe thousands of years, only kept in a few circles of these oral tradition. When Champollion, who's given the credit for translating the hieroglyphs, came along and looked at the Rosetta Stone, which had 3 different languages presented, mentioning the same type of inscription, the ancient, what the Greeks called hieroglyphica, which means sacred signs, which is a key understanding, and Demotic and Greek. Demotic was like a shorthand that had developed later dynastic times. And Greek, of course. So he worked with the Greek, worked backwards to what he thought the signs were in the hieroglyphs, and he came up with an alphabet translation. But we are taught that the language itself, which Hakim calls the Suf language, where the word Sufi comes from, actually had a degree of understanding based on the consciousness of the person involved, and that there were different levels of understanding of the signs, and only the inner priests, only the inner circles knew the full meaning of what the signs were. So what we see is what Egyptologists are translating are very mundane, simplistic understandings of what the signs mean. So Hakim gives us a whole different understanding sometimes of what the meaning of the signs were. And some are very significant. Some are just different in varied shades of degrees. But some real understanding of what the signs mean are almost diametrically opposed to what Egyptologists think the signs mean. And so their translations, I challenge severely sometimes on some of the so-called sacred texts that they're incorrect and they're superficial.
Can you give us an example, Stephen, of a hieroglyph that has been wildly misinterpreted or underinterpreted by traditional Egyptologists?
Yes, probably the key one is the term neter. And I don't have to take full credit to this. The first person who really challenged the definition of this term is someone who many of your listeners will know is probably the most outstanding independent Egyptologist, John Anthony West, who based his work on the teachings of a little known but becoming much more known in the last 30 years independent Egyptologist, hermeticist, philosopher named R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch. De Lubitsch was the first one, Schwaller, to challenge the translation of Neter. Now, it's traditionally translated by Egyptologists based on Budge, based on Champollion, as meaning god or goddess. But Schwaller challenged that, said, no, wait a minute, it's not meaning deity, like we think of deity ourselves today in our Judeo-Christian Islamic framework. It means aspect of God, if you will, or an aspect of the divine, a divine principle, an aspect of consciousness. Hakim goes even further, saying that neter in his indigenous tradition means a sense, like an aspect of consciousness, and he teaches we're innately born with 360 senses. So if we only think of the 5 that we're consciously using nowadays, look how much we are lacking in full what was the age of Aten, where people were in 360 degree, and to use your circle again, it's called full circular consciousness. So this is a key misunderstanding that we see and how Egyptologists try to translate what they call sacred texts. They see Neter as being God or goddess. So they see that this was a civilization that was basically polytheistic, worshiping hundreds of gods and goddesses, without understanding that the true meaning of Neter is an aspect of consciousness, a sense, a principle, a divine principle, meaning that these principles are within, without, that a full 360-degree understanding is a full enlightened understanding of all consciousness.
So while we're talking about the Neter, Stephen, let's talk about the house of the Neter. What is the house of the Neter?
Excellent. The term per, also mistranslated a lot by Egyptologists, meant house. And there were many of them. Per the high house, where the word pharaoh comes from, which didn't relate to the male king, related to the woman's house. This is a matriarchal, matrilineal civilization. Per ka meant the tomb, the house of the ka, or the double, the astral body, or the personality. Per ba, which meant spirit, the house of the spirit, was the temple. Now, per neter is the key one, because this is the one where we argue the most with Egyptologists that they've got it wrong. Per neter became pyramid, but pyramid is not a tomb. Per ka is tomb. So per neter meant the house of the neter, the house of the aspect of consciousness, or we like to use the word nature, because it is where the Greek word nature came from neter. So it's the house of nature. So it then becomes a house of nature. We also say house of energy. Therefore, it's talking about an energy device. This leads into the excellent work of my colleague and wonderful friend Christopher Dunn, who says the per neter.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. Our guest today is Stephen Mehler. Stephen, just before the break, we were talking about the Great Pyramid, the per neter, the house of the neter, the house of nature, as an energy device. And you were introducing us to the work of your colleague, the work that you've been doing with your colleague, Christopher Dunn. Let's talk about that, Stephen, because the two of you have created one of the most amazing views of this ancient culture and this ancient energy device that you're going to hear anywhere, and it rings of such truth. Talk with us about this energy device. In fact, if you could, paint us a picture of the way you think that this device actually functioned in its purpose in the Kameshian civilization.
Surely. And just to let people know that the term per neter, again, it's an umbrella, so that there's a lot of different functions that can fit within that definition. Now we say, in fact, Christopher and myself right now, when people ask us what we think the Great Pyramid was, we use the term it was a spiritual machine. So therefore we're covering both sides of the brain by doing that. If we just say machine, then people only think nuts and bolts, okay, power plant, like Chris calls it the Giza power plant. And they only think of it as, and a lot of people get left out in the cold. Now, wait a minute. I know that people go in there and they become initiated. There's great spiritual experiences that can happen there. So that's why we use both sides of the brain, and that is exactly how Hakim teaches it. So we say it's a spiritual machine. But within that umbrella, that rubric, there's many different concepts that can be fit. What kind of energies did it produce? Well, I think that we can say it produced hydrogen gas, we can say it produced electricity, we can say it produced microwave, radio wave energy. There's actually one of the people on our board of directors, an incredible theoretical physicist named Dr. Vladimir Krasnodar of Ukraine, who used to work in the former Soviet Union on the Mir space station, actually believes that the Great Pyramid pulses quantum waves that he can measure, so that the people who built the Great Pyramid were in a higher understanding of quantum physics that we're just rediscovering today. So within that, there's many different energy types that are going to be discovered. They're going to be found. So there's many different understandings. But what we believe it was a free energy device, as per the understanding of Nikola Tesla, T. Henry Moray, John Keeley, other people who've gone there in the last 100 years, that the Great Pyramid produced tremendous amounts of energy, all different types of energies, and it was free energy, that the people, the Cometians themselves, could bathe in that energy, use it for spiritual growth, to maintain the high level of consciousness, for healing, for energy to run their civilization. And so there's many different understandings that can be applied within there, but it was a tremendous free energy device.
Talk about the tunnels of Bu-Wizir.
Bu-Wizir is actually the Cometian term, which is the translation of which I translated in my first book, The Land of Osiris. That is actually a smaller framework within the larger understanding of Kemet. Kemet was the major general term for the full civilization, and we don't even know how large it was. We think it extended throughout Africa, through the Middle East, maybe even to Central Asia. So it was what's considered Kemet gamut is a large area. But Buwizer, the Land of Osiris, is about a 25-mile square grid that occupies one of the major sites that people think of today, from Dashur in the south to Abu Ruwash in the north, including Giza, Saqqara, Abu Sir, Abu Ghurab, another small area called Zariyat al-Rayyan. This area all had pyramids, all had temples. They were all on, I call it a grid line, meaning a vortex line, meaning a ley line, meaning a whole 25-square-mile area of magnetic vortex consistent with Earth energy, the Earth grid herself. And these pyramids all vibrated in a harmonic acoustic resonance, as like what we would look today and see power plants, to see grid lines, to see power stations all on a grid line. And the people knew this, and they also knew that there were fault lines nearby, that the energy of the Great Pyramid in particular, but all the pyramids operating, all the planetas in conjunction, in resonance, could actually alleviate earthquakes. We're working with seismic energy of the Earth itself. And the whole Buwizer line time is magnificent. And we've only, I believe, discovered a fraction of what the artifacts that could be discovered on this Land of Osiris. We see remnants of pyramids. We see some temples, I believe, under the sand, yet to be discovered. And this is probably the only point that we agree with Dr. Zahir Was about when he says that the evidence of ancient Egypt has only been maybe 10 to 18% discovered in artifacts, in remnants, in ruins. I know it's big, and that's the point. One of the major aspects of our research association is if we can get the funding, if we could get Egyptologists to dig where we say they should dig, they will find more pyramids, more temples that are under the sand. So this grid line of all these sites, and these are some of the major sites that people go to when we go on tour to Egypt. I lead tours to Egypt. I'm leaving in a couple of weeks, October 25th, on another tour. I'll be leading another tour in November of 2006. And we take people to Saqqara, to Dashur, to Giza, of course. And those are the main sites of the Land of Osiris. But, it's all the sites that I mentioned in my first book, all working together, all pyramids in harmonic resonance, and with temples aligned with them.
So we have a vast temple system created by a race of beings that might have been 50 years in advance of where we're at, technologically speaking, Stephen?
Well, we're catching up rapidly. That's a great point, William. We could have said, if we were talking now 100 years ago, if there was radio that we could be talking, we would say there were hundreds of years in advance of us. But we've just made such incredible, rapid strides technologically, not spiritually, but we are moving very rapidly spiritually in the last 30 to 40 years. But we've made rapid strides technologically in the last 100, 150 years because of people like Nikola Tesla. And so we are catching up very rapidly. So when you say maybe 50 years in advance, that's, it'd be interesting to see where we'll be 50 years from now. We gotta be able to evolve. This is what your work is about, as well as mine, spiritually as well as technologically, to be able to catch up to where we were, but certainly in advance of where we were today. And there's many different examples we can give of how I believe that we're more advanced than we are today.
And it's great that you bring up Tesla, because he seems like he's put forth as a person that did have an extra dose of consciousness, as if he had. They talk about him being able to make 3D models of his inventions in his head. That sounds like a netter sense, doesn't it?
Absolutely, William. You're perfectly right on there, and I often talk about that in presentation. That, in fact, Nikola Tesla used what is known as a very well-known Rosicrucian principle, and that's visualization. We all know about visualization today. Exactly like you said, when Tesla wanted to have an invention, a device that he could use, he would, in his mind, start to think of the device, the end product, and all of a sudden he would see in his mind a black box, and he would see the parts going into the black box to build a machine, and very quickly after that he would visualize the blueprints to build a machine. This is exactly what Christopher and I have talked about, how we think the Great Pyramid was designed and evolved in people's minds, not on paper. This is why I always tell people we will not find models of the Great Pyramid. We are not going to find papyruses that say how the Great Pyramid was built, because it was conceived totally, in toto, in people's minds. The design, how to do it, and boom, they went out and did it. No trial runs, no experiments, no failures. It was done. It was completed. We can't conceive of that today, because we always have to have experiments. We always have to have trials, although we're getting closer and closer. But you're right. Tesla was one who could do that. and applied for over 600 patents, more than anybody else combined. And the great physicist, Andrei Puharich, has made a great statement saying that Nikola Tesla virtually invented the 20th century. We would not be talking today, we'd not be on radio, we'd not be driving our cars, we wouldn't have computers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, if it wasn't for Nikola Tesla. So he was, I would agree with you, he was a modern ancient Cometian.
But then, I mean, we're talking about this magnificent civilization that, the word that comes to my mind is not only were they advanced spiritually, but it was a clean civilization. I don't see or feel or intuit any pollution coming from this culture. And then something happened. It's like they reached this amazing peak, and then something happened, and this civilization then slid away. What was it that happened to this culture, Stephen?
Well, again, as part of a natural cycle, and that's a major part of my current book, From Land into Darkness. I am very much in agreement with Barbara Hand-Clough, who's been interviewed just recently here, who's written an excellent book called Catastrophophobia, based on the work of a book she published when she was the head of Baring Company called Cataclysm 9500 BC by Allen and Dallaire. They posit very strong physical evidence that there was a major cataclysmic event around 11,500 years ago. Now, we know that there were many cataclysms through the history of our planet. Many, many, many. Some major, in fact, some paleo evolutionists think there were 6 major extinctions in the history of our planet. But 11,500 years ago, it seems like there was a major cataclysmic event. And it wiped out virtually all traces of advanced civilization, which I believe was all around the planet, not just Kemet, but all around our planet, in Asia, all throughout Africa, in even the Americas, and in Europe. And it virtually disappeared. But I think it's the source of all the mythology that you and I have studied for so many years. Why we have flood myths, why we have always the myths of people talking about a great cataclysmic event. There were many, but this one was a major one, and it impacted civilization throughout the world. How it impacted Kemet is, we think, and this is something that I want to get into with you, because we think we now have, we're gathering a group of scientists together to actually do some physical testing, to use the principles of science, physical science, to demonstrate that we think there was an accident explosion inside the Great Pyramid. And this, I believe, was definitely a direct event of the cataclysm of 11,500 years ago, 9,500 BC, that ended the Great Pyramid's function as an energy device, as a power plant. And we think we have physical proof of that. And we're going to be able to, we're getting people together now who are very excited about being able to test this if we can get permission from Zahi Hawass and the Supreme Council of Antiquities. That's a big if. But, so what happened to them? Well, they had to go into decline because the great civilization impacted because of the climate changed, water dried up, the great river, which I mentioned in my first book in the Western Desert, ended, rainfall changed, Egypt became the Sahara Desert and the Libyan Desert, so they had to not disappear, but go into a different stage where it could emerge again as what we call the dynastic time period around 5,000 years ago.
This is William Henry. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing our discussion with Stephen Mehler. Stephen, before the last break, we were talking about the rise of Kemet and then the fall of Kemet, perhaps because of a massive cataclysm, or probably no doubt because of a massive cataclysm. And then we have this period of regrouping, and this is where Hakim's teachings come to the forefront in your work. Talk about now some of the oral traditions that follow this new age that followed the Age of the Ten.
Right. Well, I talk about that it didn't happen overnight. The cataclysm was a major event, and it certainly impacted civilizations all around the world. And people actually, I think that's the origin of the myth of the sinking of Atlantis, and that people had to travel to different places which would be more habitable and good for civilization to continue. But they went into like a phase where in physical anthropology we talk about the Neolithic period, then the Chalcolithic period, and then the current periods. So that they actually had to go to a less powerful civilization, but they kept traditions. We don't believe it just totally disappeared, but it went in a less obvious degree, and I believe the oral tradition arose at this point because I believe that those that survived the cataclysm, and this is where Barbara Hand-Clough's work I think is beautiful, had an indelible scar in their psyche of this event. So therefore, there was a different approach. It wasn't that everything was going to be fine forever. We were staying in this wonderful golden age, Garden of Eden stage. And people then began to develop strategies to be able to predict if another event was going to happen like that. So they developed calendars, they developed writing, they developed astrology, the precession, the equinoxes. I believe that's all come to phase within the last 11,500 years. And to do that, I believe eventually led to the rise of religion. That's what my second book is about. But the oral tradition, at this point, they were the ones who would tell the stories of the survival of the cataclysm. They would tell about the cataclysm. They would present it in a way that could be passed down to young people so that they would understand their place in society, in the civilization, in the world, in the universe. And this led to keeping these traditions in tight groups of initiates, which eventually led to what we call secret societies, to today what's called the Illuminati, which I know you've talked about a lot yourself. But the oral tradition arose in keeping things down. And how Hakim's tradition really has arisen is once writing began. And I believe writing began with the most noblest of intents at the beginning, to try to keep the ancient wisdom alive, to develop symbols that would strike to the subconscious as archetypes, so that people would have an understanding of things without having to go through long explanations. But it had to be put down. It had to be written, because people didn't have the consciousness, the telepathic communication anymore that we believe we once had. And as we moved into this age of darkness, the age of Amun, around 5,000 years ago, maybe even as far as 6,000 years ago, is when writing then became co-opted. It became a use to control, to keep things hidden. And the oral tradition then arose from that standpoint to try to keep the ancient wisdom alive, to try to keep that which was not written down alive. In fact, Hakim always says this, when people talk to him, he shows a bias of his oral tradition. He says, if it had to be written down, it's not the whole truth. And that's, again, the reaction of the last 5,000 years or 4,000 years, where writing has become a means to control knowledge and information, not to disseminate necessarily the truth completely. And the oral tradition had to exist to keep the wisdom alive.
And another darker manifestation of this new consciousness, this fallen consciousness, is a concept that you talk about that I have a hunch that Whitley's going to want to discuss with you in more detail in the subscriber section, and that's the concept of Hanuti. What is Hanuti, Stephen, and why is it so important for us to understand that?
Yes. Hanut is a Comitian word which is loosely translated today as priest. So those became the founders of religion. Hanuti is the plural. But Hakim was very specific to me the last time we spoke a year ago about it, to say really how the Hanuti arose. But these were the ones who, by different devices, maybe by the use of psychoactive plants, maybe by the use of certain breathing exercises, by certain alchemical substances that they produce, were able to keep themselves in a higher state of consciousness than other people. And they knew that people were going to fall, and they knew that they could have a way to keep themselves in a specific elite position. Again, in this current age of darkness, we have separatist thinking. We have hierarchies. We have a division now, and not everybody is thought of as the same, where some people are considered higher than others. And so these people who later became the Hanuti developed the idea, understanding that originally the concept was there is no death. But they understood now that people were losing that consciousness. They were losing that understanding. And what was the greatest fear they could work with was to convince people that when the body dies, they die, but there is a part of them that continues. And they, the Hanuti, could be responsible for taking care of the people. So they were what we call the funerary priests in ancient Egyptology. They were the people who devised the systems and techniques that, listen, when you die, if you make preparations that I'm going to be taken care of by your family, I will make sure that your body is taken care of, and that we will pray. We will develop these techniques, these prayers, these gestures that will guarantee that your soul, your individual soul, a concept that they created, will continue on to the afterlife. And so that became religion.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Stephen Mehler. So, Stephen, essentially what we're talking about here is that the Hanuti created essentially a sales job that said that they'll care for the dead and provide for reincarnation, and essentially they profited on the creation of the concept of death, soul, and rebirth. Is that about right?
Yes, I agree. Yes, absolutely. In fact, I consider them the first profession, not prostitution, like many people do. I actually make the distinction in my book because in anthropology, sometimes a distinction is not made in academia between spirituality and religion. It's considered to be the same thing. And one of the major paradigms in academia is that we've always had religion, and I disagree with that. We've always had spirituality, but I say that religion is the business that was created around spirituality, and that's the concept of Hanuti. So Hakim and I, we use the term Hanuti to actually refer to anybody today, including politicians as well as religious leaders, who profit on people's fears. So that's a general term, what Hanuti means. So yes, they created the business of religion and kept the teachings to themselves, or just in tight groups of initiates, adepts who knew the difference and knew that there was going to be an outward teaching, an outward religion that was going to be the sales job, as you mentioned, that were going to keep them, and that they were going to be taken care of, so that these people, Hanuti, would never have to go to work or have a job, that the rest of the people would give them food, would support them, would give them high status, would listen to everything they said, and they were the ones who, along with later, became the so-called ruling classes, the political classes that we talk about today so well amongst many researchers. They formed this coalition between priesthoods and powerful ruling families that became the ruling classes for the last 5,000 years, to perpetuate this idea, to perpetuate this system, so that they would always remain in power. And that's what really meaning is the age of darkness.
Yeah, what Hakim's concepts and your concept in this regard remind me of a quote. I'm paraphrasing Carlos Santana. He says, I don't do priests, popes, pimps, or politicians.
One of my favorite musicians.
Yeah, they don't do. He doesn't do the Hanuti.
No,
Stephen, I wanted to share an email with you that I received. It was from a woman who had heard you on an interview recently, and she wrote and she said, I listened to Stephen and I read your books, referring to my books, and she says, but your ideas don't quite match. And she's like, what do I do? And I said, my advice would be for you to read Stephen's books and then read mine. And so she wrote me back this week, and she said, and I'm reading her email now, she says, I have begun to reread your books as I read those of Stephen Mehler. In my gut, I feel you are both missing something. You are so close, but still missing something. And then she says, if both your minds were working together, answers, I feel, would no longer trickle in, but flow with such force, even the old-schooled historians and governments would no longer be capable of denying the truth of what has happened over the centuries and what is happening now. And then she says, I am convinced that between the both of you, the knowledge of anti-gravity, which could change our world, will be uncovered. It's right under our noses, and we're not seeing it. If you work together and brainstorm some of those brilliant ideas that I know you both have, things could change so quickly for all of us. So how about that, Stephen?
I'm certainly willing. That is a good point, because sometimes I have to control my ego. And sometimes I think that when I listen to other people, I say, no, that's wrong. No, that's wrong. Instead of being open-minded and saying, well, wait a minute, maybe there's... And, she's actually right. I have looked at your work with renewed understanding and with renewed things that I do agree that we could come to a common understanding. First of all, I want you to come to Egypt, either with me or when you go by yourself, and meet Hakim and sit down and talk yourself, and you'd see that I think that a lot of things will be common. So I've seen a lot of more common ground in our work now than differences. But I believe she's right. We do believe we understand the use of anti-gravity in Egypt, and sound was a key role. I say there's three things that I mentioned in my two books that I've learned from Hakim, and that it's the use of sound, crystals, and running water that are the key to how the pyramid was built, how stone was cut, shaped, to the tolerances that Chris Dunn talks about, like in granite of 2/10,000ths of an inch, which we don't even approach today, was all part of anti-gravity, was the use of sound. Again, vibration. So I don't think there's so much difference between us anymore, and I think people will understand that we're all trying to come to the same thing. I think it's going to be all of us working together, putting in pieces of the puzzle, which will give us a total holistic understanding of the whole thing. So I'm certainly willing to work with you as much as possible.
Oh, well, thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate that. And I wasn't reading the email just, in hopes of getting any kind of a commitment like that. What I was getting at is, hey, I totally agree. I think all of this is right under our noses right now, and we are so close. And it's just a tremendously exciting time to be working in this area. And again, your work has brought so much clarity and the understanding that Hakim has brought. But one of the persons that you mentioned earlier that I wanted to be sure that we make sure that our listeners are introduced to is that of the work of the Rosicrucians, and in particular, I wanted to go back in time just for a quick moment to Thutmose III. Yes. And talk about the revolution that Thutmose III began to introduce.
Yes. This understanding, we'll make it brief, but when I got involved with the Rosicrucian Order, I found that there was a gentleman named Harvey Spencer Lewis who had begun the modern cycle of the Rosicrucian Order, Almark, in New York City around 1914, 1915, and he presented a different history. And when he presented his Rosicrucian histories from documents, from traditions he was given in Egypt, in France when he was initiated, of a different history of Thutmose III, who's spoken of in Egyptology. In Egyptology, Thutmose III is considered one of the great warrior kings. He extended the Egyptian empire, the Comitian empire, further than it had ever been before. So he was known as a great conqueror, warrior. But Harvey Spencer Lewis presented a different history of Thutmose III, that in the later years, when he finished his conquering days, he underwent what we could only call a spiritual reformation, that he had a spiritual enlightenment. And he decided to bring what was kept secret, the inner traditions of the oral tradition, the inner temple, which Swallow de Lubisch called it, and wanted to bring it more out in the open, more accessible to all people. So he began what can basically be called mystery schools, types of training in the temples that would teach these things openly about the all wisdom. And he began a tradition which was why he's considered the traditional founder of the Rosicrucian Order. In fact, one of the reasons that I became interested in that, I would look at documents or what's known as the Rosicrucian Digest, the magazine that the Rosicrucians put out, and there was the cartouche, the symbol, supposedly the sign of a king. It's actually a title, not his name, but there was Men Kefa Ra, which is one of the titles that Thutmose III adopted for himself. Thutmose itself was a title. And so I was always curious, why the Rosicrucians involved with him? And then I read Harvey's history, Spencer Lewis's history, saying that he's considered the traditional founder of the order, that he began his mystery schools, bringing them more out in the open, and then it was his great-great-grandson, who you and I are both very interested in, had the title Akhenaten, who began and is considered the first Grand Master of the Rosicrucian Order, who took his great-great-grandfather's beginnings, began the mystery school, began the teachings, began the cycles that became eventually the Rosicrucian Order. So we trace the Rosicrucian Order, I do, Almark does, back to ancient Egypt, not just the Middle Ages in Europe, which most scholars who consider themselves scholars of metaphysical history trace the Rosicrucian Order back to the Masons, to the Knights Templar. No, we trace it back to the time of Thutmose III and particularly Akhenaten.
Yeah, and I can't wait. Next year, coming to Nashville is the Quest for Immortality exhibit, 107 artifacts from ancient Egypt, the largest collection outside of Egypt. They're recreating the tomb of Thutmose III here in Nashville. I just can't wait to see that. So what this tells me too is that you and I think a lot alike in terms of the impact of these secret societies, that in fact they do possess some of the high spiritual teachings that we're trying to get at, but terms such as Illuminati and others have been interpreted negatively, but maybe Illuminati isn't such a negative term after all.
Well, not in its original inception. I have documents of writings of Harvey Spencer Lewis that go back to the 1918 into the 20s, where he's talking about the Rosicrucian Order being the Illuminati. So the original, let's just look at the word, like you like to do, breaking down words. Illumin means light, to bring light in. So it's obviously a system or society, a group that wanted to bring light to people, not darkness. So the original concept of Illuminati was the secret societies, the mystery schools that were in opposition to organized religion and political agendas, who were trying to keep people in darkness, in ignorance. However, as has been, and this is one of the key understandings that I always have to talk about to people, is to understand why people today are talking about the modern Illuminati. They talk about the modern Illuminati as being the groups that are trying to keep people in darkness, not illumin, to control people, the one world order, to control people's minds and thinking. Well, as I can point out over and over and over, there's many, many examples. Within the last 5,000 years, groups become co-opted. They become infiltrated. The powers of darkness, the powers that want to keep people in darkness, have tried to obfuscate, to infiltrate every group, every teaching that's tried to bring illumination to people and to bring it back into darkness. That's happened in religion, in Judaism, in Christianity, in Islam, in the Masons, in the Rosicrucians, and so-called modern Illuminati. But it's very key, William, and that's why I'm glad you brought it up, that people understand some sort of history, some sort of degree of evolution of this, that the original concept, understanding of Illuminati was the secret societies, the inner groups, to bring light to people, to keep the ancient wisdom alive. And that's been a focus in your work, I know. And so people have to understand the modern Illuminati is not what the Illuminati originally was intended to be.
Yeah, I agree, Stephen, because I started with my research on the Illuminati by going into Webster's dictionary and looking up the word.
Great.
And the very first entry said, newly baptized initiate. It's like, wait a minute, no Adam Weishaupt, you mean none of this other business? No, Illuminati means a newly baptized initiate.
Right.
And, you know, to use some of the words that you use throughout your book, it's a hopeful term, it's a liberating term, it's a term
right.
of joy and fulfillment. It's because it indicates that you're a person on the path who's trying to connect with the light and also to literally be the light. So,
in that sense, William, you and I are the modern Illuminati, and Whitley, and people who are trying to bring truth to people, not the people today who are considered the Illuminati.
I agree, absolutely, because it's all about now, as Hakeem terms it, the awakening.
The awakening.
And what I'm wondering now, Stephen, I mean, you've been at this a very long time. You've brought in so much wonderful energy here. How can an individual who's listening, one, feel like they're on the path to where they're bringing the light in, and if they're not, what are some things that you would recommend doing that will help a person to make this connection with the awakening?
Well, the first step, William, is to question. The first step is to no longer blindly accept everything they see in the papers, on television, or even that they hear in the church, synagogue, or mosque. Once you first start to question, like, wait a minute, maybe there's something else, then you make the first step of 1,000 miles, as is said in Taoism, the first step of 1,000 steps. Once a person questions and want to know more, they can go on the internet. They can go read our books, your books, my books, everybody's books, and they can go question. I take people to Egypt. They can come to Egypt with me and get these teachings from me firsthand. I always say when I bring people to Egypt, I say, look, you read my book. Some people, you're very supportive. That's great. But if you just come, look at the evidence for yourself and decide. The first step, William, is just to decide for yourself, to realize the major difference I'm saying in my book is not trust what's written in a book, even my books, your books, but to learn for yourself. Trust your own personal experience. Trust your own inner wisdom. Find God within as well as without, because that's what it's all about. So the first step is to question. Once you make the first step, the other steps go. Once the student is ready, the teacher appears. Once you look for it, you will find whatever system, whatever degree or style of teaching or practice or ritual it is that will be right for that individual person. And not any one system is right for everyone, but all systems, all paths lead to the truth once you start the path to it. And that was basically what Jesus' teachings were all about. Don't be me, follow me. Follow my path. Follow my example. Find the truth for yourself. Don't believe what anybody else tells you until you can experience it within and without, what resonates in your heart as well as your soul and mind.
There are many, many events that are going to be unfolding here of incredible importance in this awakening. I know you're not a prophet, Stephen. You don't put yourself out as such, I don't think. But can you make any predictions of some events that are going to be transpiring in, say, the next decade that are going to be clear signposts of this awakening?
Certainly. And I think, unfortunately, it's what people think of as negative signs, maybe not so negative. And that's more events like Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, like the tsunami that hit Indonesia last year. There's going to be earth changes, without a doubt. And these are signs of cleansing. These are signs of the end of a cycle. Every cycle, the end of a cycle is reflected. Again, when we were going from Aten into Amen, there was this incredible worldwide global cataclysm. I don't see that there's going to be a worldwide global cataclysm now, but there's going to be cataclysmic events happening. There's going to be artifacts found. There's going to be evidence of extraterrestrial intervention within ourselves, genetic manipulation that I'm convinced of, that we're star beings. More and more evidence, more and more sites will be discovered, more and more artifacts, more global events, and there's going to be more events of people just waking up in the middle of the night and knowing something that they didn't know before. So there's going to be a lot of things, more and more within the next few years. We're going to see a lot more global events, a lot more events that are going to relate to consciousness, a lot more artifacts discovered, inventions discovered, theories discovered, which are going to lead us to a more total holistic understanding.
Beautiful. You closed the book with a term that was given by Hakim, and that term is yakini.
Oh, beautiful.
What does that mean?
Oh, this is a wonderful, wonderful thing for people to understand. And why it's said twice. He says basically it means I am protected by the power of my positive, which means once you know, and you know that you know, no one else can convince you otherwise. So you're positive that you know what you know. So that's yakini. But when you say it twice, yakini, I am protected by my knowledge. Now, this is true knowledge. This is not book knowledge. Again, this is experiential knowledge. This is knowledge which radiates from every cell, every core, every fiber of our beings, that we know what we know. And we're positive we know what we know. So therefore, when you say it twice, yakini, I am protected by my positive that I know. And no one can dissuade me. No one can bring me back. So that means if I'm in the light, darkness can never dispel that light.
Okay, Stephen, that sounds like a great place to conclude this interview. I want to once again thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. We really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, William, always.
Look forward to talking with you again. This is William Henry. This has been Dreamland. I'll look forward to talking with you next time.
And subscribers, Stephen and I, this is Whitley Strieber back again, are going to be talking about some pretty surprising stuff. Is there a God? Is there a soul? Well, he's going to make you drop your teeth. You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science, discovery, and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com. This week she's reporting on bird flu and an incredible experience from some farmers in England. Here she is, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. Well, recently on Dreamland, I reported about a veterinarian in Calhoun, Colorado, who said that 16 horses all died from a lightning strike in mid-October. Now, this week, there comes news from New South Wales, Australia, that 106 dairy cows all died instantly on Monday, October 31st, from lightning strikes in Dorrigo and Glen Innes, north of Sydney. A lightning detection network which monitors thunderstorms detected more than 75,000 strikes hitting southeast Australia between October 24th and November 1st. Of those, 500 were in the Dorrigo region. There's a photograph at my news website, earthfiles.com, of some of the 68 dairy cows on one farm that died instantly in Dorrigo, and the same day, about 125 miles away at Glen Innes, another farmer lost 38 cows in a lightning strike. So lightning can hit a lot of animals at the same time and knock them dead. In other animal death news, the deadly H5N1 bird flu is making headlines around the world. This week on November 1st, President George Bush announced his administration's plan to prepare for a possible global outbreak of H5N1. The fear is that this avian flu virus will mutate beyond birds to human transmission, similar to what happened in 1918 when the awful Spanish flu killed more than 50 million people around this planet. Recently, scientists announced that the 1918 virus also originated in birds and has similarities to the H5N1 now spreading through migratory birds. The American government's preparation plan includes stockpiling antivirals and vaccines that might work against the H5N1 virus. Currently, I've talked to a few virologists who say there are promising vaccines being tested right now on humans. Increasing public health's ability to deal with overwhelming numbers of people going to hospital emergency rooms is vital, and keeping the public aware about what the facts really are. To do this, the Bush administration wants Congress to make $7.1 billion available to modernize flu vaccine production in the United States. The goal is to be able to inoculate every American, all 300 million of us, within 6 months of a pandemic's eruption. But the problem is that could take years. The government's current goal is 2010, and that's only 5 years from now, and the H5N1 virus is unpredictable, mutating, and any day could change into one that can transmit human to human. China's most famous virologist, Dr. Guan Yi, has already sequenced the genetic code for more than 250 strains of H5N1. That means that the H5 bird flu virus has changed 250 times at least in less than a decade. And this is not good news. The new strains seem to be more virulent, killing infected birds within 24 hours and killing some humans within 5 days who have picked up the virus from birds. Not only is the latest bird flu virus more virulent in lab animal tests, it seems to be increasing its virulence among wild water birds that should be healthy. The World Health Organization reported in the spring of 2005 that at least 6,000 wild migratory geese at a nature reserve in central China suddenly died from an H5N1 strain. WHO described the large number of rapid deaths as, quote, highly unusual and probably unprecedented, unquote. So far, H5N1 has killed an estimated 140 million birds in China and Southeast Asia. And that includes those destroyed by authorities trying to stop the virus's spread. Killing infected birds began all the way back in 1997 when H5N1 first showed up in very ill Hong Kong patients. That virus, H5N1, had never, ever been seen in people before 1997, and when several people died, that set off alarm bells in the world medical community. The Hong Kong government ordered that more than 1 million chickens be destroyed. But even though killing and incinerating infected birds has been standard operating procedure now for nearly 10 years, the H5N1 virus has continued to spread through migratory birds. Now the deadly virus is in Europe, spreading in October to Kazakhstan, Russia, Romania, Croatia, Turkey, and Greece. Between November 1st and 2nd in Russia, 2 more birds died from H5N1 confirmed, bringing the total in that country to more than 4,000 bird deaths recently, either from the H5N1 virus or from slaughtering. So far, no humans in Russia have contracted the bird flu, but Newsweek reported in its November 7th, 2005 issue that there have been 138 human cases in Southeast Asia, of which at least 69 people have died. The most recent H5N1 human infections have been in Thailand, where more than 20 people have been seriously ill, and half of those died. That 50% mortality rate in humans has also been seen in Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, and China. What no one knows is when or if the H5N1 virus that's supposed to infect only birds will mutate into a virus that can spread human to human through sneezing and coughing. That is the nightmare that medical people are worried about. Now, how do people get the H5N1 virus? By handling infected birds or bird feces during slaughtering, butchering, removing feathers, or preparing raw poultry for cooking. You cannot get it from well-cooked poultry. What are the bird flu symptoms in humans? Hot fever, body aches, nausea coming on very rapidly, with vomiting and diarrhea that can lead to hepatitis, kidney failure, and an abnormal deficiency in all blood cells, red, white, and platelets. And that means that the H5N1 infection affects more body organs and systems than normal flu, and H5N1 kills directly and rapidly, while other flu deaths are often related to secondary infections caused by bacteria. New computer models show that if all the families in an affected area where this might erupt suddenly human to human, If those families quarantine themselves and as many people as possible are treated for 10 days with an antiviral medicine such as Tamiflu, plus H5N1 experimental vaccines, an eruption of H5N1 among people might be contained. This is the key now to the current strategy. Contain it where it erupts with more modern medicine than they had in 1918. At the very first sign of fever, sore throat, and body aches, use antivirals such as Tamiflu, and it can be 86% effective in slowing down viral spread in the human body. Tamiflu has stopped some H5N1 strains in lab tests. Now the problem is hoarding. The American sales of Tamiflu have quadrupled the past few months, provoking the Swiss pharmaceutical Roche temporarily to suspend shipments to the United States because they needed supplies for other countries. So now there is a plan for Roche to build a Tamiflu antiviral production plant now inside the United States, specifically to cope with an impending pandemic. And now to another kind of animal death that is also worldwide, but so highly strange. In the 1970s, places in southern England, including Dartmoor, Cornwall, and Devon, had hundreds of people reporting strange, unidentified lights in the sky and on the ground. People also saw humanoids, tall ones, short ones. Cattle herds were mysteriously transported at night, literally from one farm to another. And animals were killed without blood or signs of struggle, in which the same tissues were excised. Often it's an ear, an eye, the jaw flesh, the tongue removed deep within the throat, sometimes along with the trachea and the esophagus. All or parts of genitals are excised, and rectal and or vaginal tissue cored out in deep, bloodless holes. Recently, 6 dead sheep were found on October 14th to 15th on a farm in Moortown, which is straight east of Tavistock in Dartmoor. The Dartmoor Forest National Park has long been famous for mysterious lights and mysterious sounds. One famous case in the region goes all the way back to 1977, when more than a dozen ponies were found laid down in a circle, and all of their bodies were crushed by an unknown force. Because the horses were laid in a circle, the event was linked to the disc-shaped UFOs that were seen so frequently at the time. And earlier this year in January, there were 7 other sheep mutilations in Moortown, making a total of 13 animals in 2005, all found dead with twisted, broken necks, and yet none of the sheep had any blood on them. The BBC News reported, quote, "Police in Devon are investigating after 7 sheep were found dead and arranged in an unusual pattern on Dartmoor. The pattern was similar to the shape of a star, a heptagram, a mystical 7-pointed symbol sometimes used in occult ceremonies," unquote. However, contrary to that BBC report, the farm owner had photographs that clearly showed the 7 sheep randomly scattered in the field. There was no star pattern, and certainly not one with 7 points. And that left me and many others wondering, why would the BBC suggest a 7-pointed star and an occult connection without any confirming evidence? One British resident investigated both the January and October 2005 sheep mutilations. He is Michael Freebury. He's a financial controller with Moreland Construction Limited in Walsall, West Midlands, England. He took a deep interest in the 1977 pony crushing, and he now begins from his investigations of these 2005 sheep mutilations with the most recent October bloodless sheep death.
So I asked the lady who owned these sheep, will you please go and check the mouths this time and tell me if there are any tongues missing. And the tongues were missing from all 6 sheep. The tongues had been excised in just the same sort of fashion that occurs in other animal mutilations.
There was no sign of blood?
There was no sign of blood. I mean, this is what absolutely astonished the people, because there was no blood anywhere. Now, there was another thing as well regarding the 2 sheep that were killed on Saturday the 15th, because on one of the sheep, the eye that was showing had been completely removed. And on the other dead sheep, both eyes had been removed. Now, if the sheep was lying down, you can't put that down to predators.
Right.
And the farmer herself said to me, I've never seen anything like that before. Remember, these are people that live with, they farm sheep all their lives, they know everything there is to know about sheep and predators and anything that could affect a sheep.
Have these farm owners in October said to you that they have seen anything unusual in the sky or heard anything unusual?
Nothing unusual at all. In fact, this is one of the strange things that the first set of killings took place in an area that was really only 100 yards or so from a farm where there are very alert dogs, where there is a rookery, which is well known for raising the alarm when there's unusual activity. It's quite extraordinary how they could have done it and nobody knew what the hell was going on.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, really strange. And time again, we have these stories where they come, they do it, and they're gone, and nobody hears or sees anything. The police have not a clue. And they sent a forensic team to look at the one set of bodies. Now, I haven't spoken to the police, but I don't know what they're like in the United States, but in Britain, the police will tell you nothing.
Right. And there's no signs of struggle or physical evidence on the ground?
No tracks. There were some stones allegedly placed, which people are claiming gave some sort of occult significance. But to be honest, we're in an area where witchcraft has long been sort of discussed, and where many strange things happen. It's not far from the major town of Tavistock, which is a very nice market town. But the area where these killings occurred is extremely remote. It could almost be, in the desert.
What is it about the Dartmoor area, do you think, that seems to be the focus of these unusual animal deaths over 40 years?
It's very difficult to say, because I've been racking my brains to think what the common denominator is. I've got a very good idea who, or should I say, what is doing this.
Do you mean extraterrestrial biological entities?
Well, you can draw your own conclusion.
Well, that's what law enforcement tells me in this country on and off the record.
Yeah, I think you're not far off the mark with that. I cannot understand what else could do it.
Right, and what is the agenda? Why the focus over and over, decade after decade, in certain parts of the world, in the same geographical areas? Right?
There may be something to do with the terrain, I don't know, because this area of Dartmoor is very remote. So is an area closer to me, Shropshire, where there have been a number of animal mutilations close to the Welsh border, which again is a very remote and mountainous area. Also, we've had mutilations in Scotland and in North Yorkshire. The common denominator with these killings appears to be that the animal victims, particularly in this country, appear to be sheep, which are free-ranging animals. Now, I don't know whether that is a key to the attacks, because sometimes they can be attacked in fields, and sometimes when they are out ranging on moorland or whatever. I'm confused by the fact that in the USA it seems to be principally cattle and horses, but are these cattle and horses ranging over a large area?
The cattle are usually not the horses. And in the United States, even though cattle have predominated, horses were the first reported mutilated animals in Canada and then in Colorado before any reports of cattle.
Are they looking at animals that are basically hardy animals that can live in rough terrain? Is that the key?
Well, that wouldn't explain the cases that people have found them right outside 30 feet from the back of their ranch house in corrals.
Yeah. It's extremely difficult and complex to know what is really going on here, but it is a major problem here in the UK. They're trying to keep the lid on it. The government won't admit anything. It's probably different in the US.
They tend to shy away from any explanation except satanic cult, predators, or disease here, even when they know that it's not true.
Yeah, well, that seems to be, I think in this country what we tend to have is it's either the occult or it's an escaped panther or an escaped lion or something like this.
But I know from studying what those kinds of cats do to all kinds of animals, and they always leave claw marks, they always leave bite marks, and they always leave blood.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. There is no blood with these cases. It's as if it's almost like a vampire attack.
Before these recent October 14th to 15th sheep mutilations in Moorhart, Michael Freebury had traveled to Dartmoor in April of 2005 to visit the farm owner who found the first round of 7 dead and mutilated sheep on her farm on January 2nd. After talking with the farmer and seeing her photographs, Mike Freebury was alarmed that the BBC had reported the 7-pointed star and occult connection as if those were news facts when they were not. There was no evidence to support that speculation. In fact, Mike Freebury was dismayed to learn that no reporter from the BBC had ever gone to Dartmoor to investigate this case.
And these killings were, in my opinion, nothing to do with the occult. Mm-hmm. There was no blood. The necks had all been broken. It was a quite bizarre set of killings. Now, there was something else to all this, that the sheep, prior to death, were actually corralled into two very small areas, about maybe 6 yards apart. They were held in these areas for what must have been at least 20 minutes to half an hour. We know that because the ground had been poached or trodden. The tracks there indicated how long they'd been there. They were then taken and killed one by one. Now that is extraordinary because there were no tracks. Nobody knew how they'd been kept within these two corral areas. And there were no indications that the sheep had panicked. They had obviously been kept there sedated in some way. And all the victims, all 7 victims, had some sort of marks on them, prod marks.
And those marks were all under all 4 legs of these mutilated sheep that had other excisions that were bloodless. And you can see some photographs of the animals were laid in the pasture in the January case at my news website, earthfiles.com. On the headlines page, there is a hot link to this report, Sheep Mutilations in Moortown, Dartmoor, England. And it is very noteworthy that Whitley, we have talked about those quarter-inch punch holes in the horses in Calhan in Colorado recently. And what Mike Freebury does not know is that there has been no public veterinarian report of any kind. Did they find similar holes in these bruise areas underneath the legs of the sheep in England, because the Colorado Calhan veterinarian was at least honest enough to say that where there were these bruises on the horses, they found these odd puncture holes.
You know, Linda, this is a really bizarre and powerful report. I have not often heard you do one that has really hit this hard, in the sense that there's evidence here from this man's description of what's going on that not only is this happening, but it's a much worse problem than we're being allowed to know. I mean, how much is getting out and how much isn't getting out? What is your sense of that? Are they actually suppressing information about this now?
Very much so. And it reminded me, in talking with Mike Freebury when I was in England in 1992 to 93, and I was working my first crop circle investigations, but while I was there had been a series of mutilations down also in southern England, and I drove down, went to the Mark Cherry farm, and to see the photographs that they had taken, and they had 5 young animals. These were cattle. Every single one of them had the tail removed right up to the base of the spine. They had the eye removed, the tongue removed, and these were 5 animals within 4 days in a pasture that I walked, went down to a creek, went around with a farmer. And this was in southern England in that 92 to 93 time period. And I reported about this and showed the photographs in my book, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 1. And while I was doing that investigation, I was amazed to keep learning about other animal mutilations, talk with other farmers. When I asked one farmer, could I please go to the vet? A vet had been called out. Again, this was another area of sheep that had been killed, a lot of sheep. And the farmer said, I'll give you the name and I'll give you the phone number, but Linda, even if I tell the vet to talk with you, I don't think that he will. And I tried. While I was there, I physically called up the veterinarian's office, explained that I was from the United States, had done a great deal of investigation on unusual animal deaths, and hoped that I could come and talk with him on or off the record. And I was politely told in a British accent that the veterinarian would not be available for any discussion on those cases.
Do you think that he was being prevented from talking, or like there was a coroner in the United States in a human mutilation case that you tried to investigate who told you outright that he had been told not to talk?
That's right, and refused to talk with Dr. John Altschuler in Denver. Well, you know, in England it's hard to know because it's famous for being tight-lipped, and whether or not it's justified in some cases, I think that the British law enforcement and veterinarians, I think that they are more zip-lipped than they are in the United States. I prefer the approach with some of the law enforcement and veterinarians here who are at least willing to share some facts in some cases. And then when we are able to compare case to case and we find these bizarre similarities, like these punch holes that nobody can explain and bruises under the punch holes without any projectile, without any signs of any kind of metal, this is really important. And my guess is that if there are any more of these cases in England, and Mike Freebury will be there when they're fresh, that we'll be able to find out for sure if those punch holes are there as well. If they are, this is another one of those signs that, to me, when Lieutenant Colonel Corso told me, we are definitely dealing with extraterrestrial biological entities in the worldwide animal mutilation phenomenon, that would explain why the same characteristics would be from country to country and hemisphere to hemisphere.
Next week on Dreamland, induced after-death communication.
Paradigms of academia don't seem to fit before me. And one of the most stringent paradigms that I'm most against is this idea of linear evolution, that everything is moved in a straight line, actually physical evolution and human evolution. And the major theme that Hakeem presents to us is a similar theme among indigenous people all around the world, Native Americans, Maya people, Hopi people, Inca, pre-Incan people, and the people in Asia and in Africa. That thing line. And we have been through a series of cycles before there was a beginning, because the tradition says it even wasn't a beginning. So the idea that we bring forth is that we have been through a series of cycles in human evolution, cultural and physical, and that we're coming to the end of a particular phase of a major cycle now. And this is a key teaching that you, I know, have seen reflected in all mythologies of all people around the world, the Mayan calendar, the Hopi calendar, the Aztec calendar. So many groups around the world of indigenous wisdom keepers are saying we're coming to the end of a cycle now. And this is one of the major facets of Hakim's teaching, that we're coming out of a cycle of darkness. That's the reason's the title of my book, From Light into Darkness. We're coming out of a cycle in darkness, ready to come to a dawn of a new consciousness, which he calls the awakening.
And I really like the idea of the cycles, the concept, because as you point out in your book, From Darkness into Light, or pardon me, Stephen, From Light into Darkness, the symbol for the cycle is a circle. And another way of describing a circle is a ring. And a ring is one of those curious words. It's a pun, a play on words, because a ring is also a vibration. And of course, as you talk so eloquently, vibration is really what all of this is all about, isn't it?
Very, very good. That's very much a key point. And again, you see so many cooperations and collaborations from different teachings. One of the major things I learned getting involved with the Rosicrucian teachings.
Term full consciousness mean, and what happened to these people?
Well, again, here's a key difference, perhaps, in Hakim's presentation from other people, and that nobody was at fault. You know, a lot of another facet of your work is Atlantis and the myth of Atlantis. And a lot of people put forth the contention that Atlantis fell because of the degeneration of people's thinking and practices. You know, now that may be true. I don't deny that may not be true. But Hakim is very adamant that this is just a natural progression of cycles. So we go through what he calls the 5 stages of the sun. The number 5, and many numbers, but 5 is one of the key numbers in this teaching. 5 stages of the sun, 5 stages of our consciousness, 5 stages of human evolution. And the stage of Aten that you mentioned, Aten in his translation means the wiser, which means the full state of consciousness, full flowering of the senses, where we could actually say that everybody was in some degree of enlightenment. And it's just a natural state that we then go into Amen, the state we're in now, which means the hidden darkness, and that we fell from consciousness, and we forgot who we were. And it's taken us 5,000 years to get to the point now where we are beginning your work, my work, Whitley's work, everybody's work who comes on this show to be interviewed by you is part of bringing back the dawn, the awakening, coming back into consciousness. So it's a natural cycle. He does not see a blame. He does not see blaming anybody. It's God's fault. It's human's fault. It's behavior's fault. It is just a natural cycle. So we go up to a higher stage, Aten, and then we fall to the lowest stage. And it is a big fall. And that's the stage we're coming out of.
Yeah, and one of the terms that you introduced a moment ago is this word, Kamitian wisdom teachings. Let's start with that name. Who are the people of Kemet, and what are the Kamitian wisdom teachings?
Well, again, it was a Rosicrucian order, Amorc, which means A-M-O-R-C, which means Ancient Mystical Order Rosicrucis, is one of the basic teachings that all is vibration. All. And so that everything is a vibratory rate that exists in the actual, and it's what we create as reality is what we perceive those vibrations that filter through our brain processes or whatever, and we create reality. And this is one of the basic teachings that we know the ancient Cometians, Egyptians had, and it is relevant, and it's being demonstrated today in quantum physics. One of the major quotes I use in my book from quantum physicist Fred Alan Wolf is, "The vacuum vibrates," which discussing, everything that is. So vibration is very key. And that comes to a concept of the use of sound by ancient people, the use of vibrations, the understanding this, and one of the key things that we're bringing forward is that we were those people. In other words, a major facet of Whitley's work in Dreamland is, of course, a possibility of the extraterrestrial connection, a possibility that we are not indigenous to this planet, that we may be starseeds, which I agree, and which is part of a lot of indigenous teachings, part of Hakim's teachings too. But the idea is that we were these ancient people that built the pyramids, carved the Sphinx, but that we have fallen. And this is where the fall comes through. And in your work, which is so much a part of mythology. This fall from a golden age, from a time when we were in total consciousness. And this is a key part of Hakim's teachings, that we are just been semi-conscious this last 5,000 years of this cycle, and we're about to wake out of that. And so vibrations are part of breaking up this darkness and getting us back into the light.
Yeah, this idea of full consciousness is one of the ideas that you propose that really caught my imagination. And you, in conjunction with that, you describe an age of Aten when people had full consciousness. What does this...
I'm going to be discussing this further with Stephen in our subscribers section. I believe, and I just want to say at the outset of the show before William takes over, this is one of the most important books I've read in maybe a very, very long time. There are issues here that are absolutely essential to understand in order to be part of the change of the age, in the way that all of us who are gathered around in this dreamland community and unknown country community and this larger community of seekers are here to be. There are signals in here that you need to know. Very important book, From Light into Darkness. So with that said, let me welcome William Henry to this radio program as guest host of Dreamland.
Thank you, Whitley, very much. As Whitley said, our guest today is Stephen Mehler. Stephen, as Whitley has mentioned here, and I think is as excited as I am about talking with him, is Stephen's just a true spark of the light of truth. After his book, Land of Osiris, was published in 1998, he jumped to the top of the class of independent Egyptologists. There's few better than Stephen Mehler. He's the director of the Great Pyramid of Giza Research Association, along with Christopher Dunn. And he's been reviving an indigenous oral tradition that still exists in Egypt, and he's been able to uncover and study it with the help of a living master of this tradition, Hakim. Stephen's here with a wake-up call and to discuss teachings that existed before religion and other subjects from his new book, From Light into Darkness. Stephen, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you, William. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and it's great to be on Dreamland again.
Really a pleasure, and thank you for making time to talk with us today. Stephen, I've got about a million things I'd like to ask you about. Of course, your work with the indigenous teacher Hakim, your work with Christopher Dunn. You've been making some incredible discoveries about the prehistory of Egypt and about cycles of consciousness. And even though you've been at this over 35 years, it appears as if you're just getting started. Talk about how things have changed in terms of your perception of Egypt and where things are at this particular moment.
Well, yes, we say formally I've been studying the subject for over 37 years, as you mentioned, but it really has been a lifelong search for me. It happened around the age of 8, 2 significant events in my life, and I just happened to see a picture of the Great Pyramid and Sphinx in a National Geographic magazine, and something always stuck in my mind about it. It didn't spark me at that moment to say that Egyptology was going to be my life's goal, but I always had an interest in Egypt, and all the contemporary things that came around in my life about Egypt just didn't seem to make sense. It seemed to be that there was more beyond what was presented to me. So always maintained an interest in that, but it was significantly a book in 1968, published posthumously after Sigmund Freud died, called Moses and Monotheism. It really was the spark for me. And since 1968, this has been my life search and life work. And it led me through the academic field of Egyptology, which didn't seem to satisfy. I then went into the metaphysical mystery school tradition of the Rosicrucian Order, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. And there still seemed to be more to it. And eventually, to make a really long story short, in 1992, I had the opportunity to go to Egypt. I knew at that point that there was an existence of an oral tradition that was still evident in Egypt. I went in search of it, and lo and behold, the first day I was in Egypt, my tour guide was the gentleman you mentioned, Abdel Hakim Aoyan. Everybody knows him as Hakim. He has been an active tour guide. He's basically semi-retired now for over 50 years, and there he was, and he is a keeper of the oral tradition.
So now, what would you say is the primary question you're trying to answer, or maybe have answered as a result of your recent research?
Well, first of all, I consider myself, among many other researchers today, like yourself, a paradigm buster, in that the accepted